I've run Curse of Strahd several times now, and I can safely say that out of all the campaigns released so far for the 5th edition, this is my favorite. Each time I run the adventure I pick up on a few things that worked well that I should keep in mind next time, and a few things that I could have done a little bit differently. And so I thought I would share my best advice for running Curse of Strahd with my fellow DMs. One of the more unique aspects of Curse of Strahd is how several parts of the adventure is randomized via the Tarokka deck. This gives the adventure a bit of replayability and helps to avoid spoilers between different groups, as the cards are always different. Furthermore, the cards give the players important clues to go on and help guide them to the tools they will need to take down Strahd. I've seen a lot of discussions online about whether or not you should rig the cards beforehand and how to handle the reading itself, and here's my advice. First, you shouldn't rig the cards per se, but you should absolutely lay them for yourself before you even start the adventure. Draw the cards and write down which ones you got, then place them back in order on top of your deck. Since the cards are drawn in a very particular order, it is easy to make sure they remain the same. There are several reasons why I think it is so important to do this ahead of time. First, the cards change the way certain NPCs act, things that are asked of players, and the locations of items, and it's very possible that your players may encounter someone or some place altered by the cards before they get to the card reading. This is especially true when it comes to the villagers of Barovia. If one of them is the chosen ally, then perhaps they should have already joined forces with the group. And often in my games that I run, the players haven't actually returned to Barovia until after Strahd's defeat. Secondly, it helps a lot as a DM when planning out the adventure and what locations and NPCs would be important to know as much as possible beforehand. If you play with miniatures, for example, you might want to invest in a specific miniature for their ally. Or if there is a location you know will be important, you can prepare battle maps and handouts beforehand. Thirdly, it ruins the flow of a Tarokka reading scene if you have to stop to check and find out the meaning of each card as it's drawn. Madame Eva knows what each card means, and wouldn't pause to figure out their meaning. She might pause for dramatic effect, but that should involve less flipping of pages as you scramble to read through the adventure book. It is unlikely you will manage to memorize every single card meaning, but you should be able to remember or just write down the 5 you've already drawn. Speaking of the card reading itself, you should absolutely play it out. It's one of the most iconic scenes in the adventure after all, and handled right, your players will be speaking of Madame Eva for weeks to come. If your players cannot peek behind your DM screen and you're feeling a little bit dexterous, then I suggest separating out the top 5 cards that you've already drawn and then let your players cut and shuffle the deck. Then sneak the last cards back on top. If you're feeling a little nervous, then don't be afraid to rehearse the card reading or writing a little script for yourself. But players should realize that this will be some of the most important information they will receive during the entire campaign, and hopefully won't interrupt. And if they do, then just make sure that Madame Eva makes it clear that they should wait with any questions until after the reading. Strahd is the main feature of the story. The players may be the protagonists, but Strahd has top billing. How you handle Strahd can make or break your game. The players should feel like they know him towards the end, and he should never be far from their thoughts. I suggest to introduce the players to Strahd as early as possible. An encounter with Strahd can easily lead to combat, but don't let that discourage you from having your group face him early on. He is curious about them, and he has no desire to kill them early in the tale. Instead, if the encounter leads to bloodshed, have him teach them a lesson. Leave them bloodied and perhaps scarred, but alive. Let them know that they only live because he chose to spare them. But an early encounter with Strahd could also be civil. Don't be afraid to have him greet them at the Blood on the Vine Tavern, visit their campfire at night and give them advice, or offer them a ride in his carriage. The first encounter may very well be anonymous as well, especially if the players do not yet realize what their situation is. Strahd has a long history of using other names and guises to get what he wants. Regardless of when you introduce your players to Strahd, don't let him fade away. He is a hands-on villain, and he should never be far from the players' minds. Have him show up at least a few more times throughout the tale, whether to test them, punish them, or congratulate them. Even when Strahd isn't around, make sure the players know that this is his land, from his visage on the coins that they pay for their drinks with, to the curses muttered by the villagers. Slip in little reminders of Strahd. Make your players feel like he could be around any corner. And remember, Strahd knows almost everything the players do, and is almost always watching in one way or another. Never forget that the players should be pursued by spies or under scrying spells for large parts of the adventure, and Strahd will more than likely act on whatever he learns. One thing I've always had in my back pocket, that is yet to play out, revolves around Strahd's journal. Should he ever learn that the players have it in their possession, I always imagine that he would be furious, since it gives a very personal look into his history. Keep track of where the players read the book, who they show it to, and when they discuss it. Should one of Strahd's scrying spells overlap at the time, or if one of his spies notices them with it, you can have Strahd make an appearance to force the group to hand it over. This can be especially useful if the players have only had civil encounters with Strahd, and might be starting to show some sympathy for the devil. Then this would give you a chance to show his bestial and ruthless side, as he spares no means to recover the book. During the campaign, the players will most likely find themselves at the Wizard of Wine's winery, and be tasked with recovering 2 magical gems for the winemakers that allow them to grow the grapes necessary to produce their fine wines. As you probably know, there used to be a 3rd gem as well, a gem that allowed for the growing of the grapes necessary to make the winery's finest wine, Champagne de l'Estompe. I've noticed in the games I've run that every single group seems to become obsessed with both the recovery of that 3rd gem and finding and tasting some of that champagne. So I highly recommend that you as a DM plan accordingly. You see, the location of the 3rd gem isn't mentioned anywhere in the adventure. It is left entirely up to you as a DM to come up with what happened to it. Since your group will potentially obsess over finding it, my advice is to try to do something special with it. The first time I ran Curse of Strahd, I let the gem be in the possession of the Abbot of Kresk. He had taken it to make sure he could feed the Bellevue family. After all, what importance was a little bit of wine and luxury in the grand scheme of things, compared to him being able to grow enough food to support the ever-growing Bellevues? The last time I ran Curse of Strahd, however, I did something a little bit different. I wrote a whole new extended story around the missing gem, involving a burhag, a desperate outcast thief from Barovia, and a family tragedy. It turned out real well, and became one of the more memorable parts of the campaign for my latest group, as they were very invested in the search for the gem. Now there are a few things you want to keep in mind when deciding where the gem is. First off, the Markov family are were-ravens and part of the Keepers of the Feather, and as such they essentially have their own network of spies across Barovia. So it should be well hidden and not in any obvious place that they would frequently fly by. Otherwise, the family would have learned of its location a long time ago. Secondly, whoever stole the gem needed to know it was there. It isn't exactly common knowledge that the Wizard of Wines has these gems, or what they do. Whoever stole them would have needed some sort of way of locating them, because even if they knew that they were magical gems buried somewhere in the fields, they would most likely have to dig up a large portion of the vineyard just to find them. The thieves may have had inside information, which is one of the reasons why many suspect Danica of being behind the theft, a theory that has yet to be true in any of my games. Or the thieves may have had access to some sort of magic, like the help the druids got from Baba Lysaga to find the other 2 stones. Regardless, the thieves should have some means of finding the gems. Lastly, it's important to think about what the gem is doing right now, and what effect it has on the world. We know that a gem planted in the ground causes the land to become extremely fertile, and that they can be used to bring things to life. I always imagine that the gems are powerful arcane power sources capable of being used in a myriad of ways. Regardless, whatever the gem is now, it will be affecting the land around it. If someone is using it in a similar way to how the Martikovs have been using the gems, they would have extremely bountiful harvests and overladen fields. It would be hard to miss in places such as Vallaki. If they're using the gem in any other way, it should have a equally noticeable effect. Barovia should be a dangerous land, and your players should be hesitant towards crossing through the dark woods at night or towards making long journeys, but chances are after a while your players will be so powerful that nothing can really challenge them anymore. It is at this point that the fear of the enemies and the sense of dread and horror starts to fade. So it's important that you as a DM keep the battles intense and important. Don't throw monsters at your players who will just easily be swept to the side, unless they can serve some other purpose. If your players start blowing through random encounters, then consider making battles more rare, but instead make each fight more dangerous. Don't be afraid to throw in extra monsters, giving them new and unexpected abilities, or using tactics to your advantage to make sure the combat never becomes a routine. And if you cannot make the combat interesting, then just avoid it altogether. Chances are your group is going to be spending quite a bit of time running around Barovia and traveling back and forth. And as I mentioned earlier, the land should feel unwelcoming and dangerous. It should never be guaranteed that the players can travel anywhere safely. Now, that doesn't mean that the players always have to have an encounter on every single journey, just that they should feel like it's always a possibility. Like there could be danger around every corner. The random encounters in the book can help with this, and overall they're pretty good. But if your players travel around enough, you may start to find that you're running short on encounters, and especially some encounters will start to occur over and over again. There are only so many times a party can and should face off against a ravenous pack of wolves, and after a while your players will be far too powerful for many of the encounters in the book. As such, I recommend that you put a little bit of effort into fleshing out and expanding on the random encounters provided. This is especially true if you're rerunning Curse of Strahd with a group who may have seen everything already and think they know what they're in for. One of the easiest things you can do is to simply mash together some of the encounters. When you roll up that wolf encounter for the 5th time and your players are too powerful for the wolves to be a credible threat, why not throw in some direwolves as well, or maybe a werewolf or two? The 2nd time the group meets a group of berserkers, they might be escorting a druid and his creations. There are a lot of monsters in the monster manual, Volos and Mordenkainens, that fit great into Barovia, so have a few of your favorites ready to rumble in case the normal encounters start feeling stale. And also remember that the random encounters aren't just combat encounters. You can use the opportunity to introduce players to NPCs they have missed, plant plot hooks for locations, or just freak them out with some horror. I wrote 42 new random encounters for use with my own Curse of Strahd games and uploaded them to the DM's Guild. I'll add a link below. You can get them for free, so why not check them out, and perhaps you'll be inspired to come up with some encounters of your own. We got our first look at Barovia back in 1983 with the release of the original Ravenloft adventure. Since then, we have revisited the land many times through the many editions of D&D that have been released. As such, there is a whole lot of extra information out there about Barovia. The Curse of Strahd book does paint a rather vivid picture of the land, and it definitely offers more than enough information for you to run the adventure, and the land has changed quite a bit from how it was depicted earlier. But don't be afraid to do a little bit of research on how things looked in earlier editions. There are several locations that can be expanded upon with the help of material from previous editions, such as the Sirpool Falls or locations in Vallaki and Barovia. But there is also a whole lot of information out there that can help you portray the land and the people with more detail. Things such as clothing, food culture, flora and fauna have all been explored in previous works. None of it's necessary, but a lot of it can be helpful, especially if you want to mix things up a bit. I've DM'd a lot of horror RPGs, and I found that to pull off a good horror game you need to amp up both the horror and the comedy. A lot of DMs I've known who have run horror games have just focused on the horror aspects, but if everything is misery and suffering, you will find that your players will start to grow numb towards it. They will simply stop caring. Others will be unwilling to fully embrace the horror, pulling their punches, which leads to the whole adventure falling flat. You need to find a good balance between horror and comedy. Play up both parts when you're able to. Savor those silly moments and natural ones, make people laugh, because then when the darkness falls, it will seem that much darker. Don't be afraid to let terrible things happen to your players or to the people of Barovia, but let there be a little bit of hope on the horizon. Lull your players into a false sense of security, because then they will fall so much harder when you finally pull the rug out from beneath their feet. In most cases, when running Curse of Strahd, your players will be visitors from a different plane of existence, namely Toril, who have been drawn into Barovia and as such have no connection to the land or its people. As such, it may seem like their background matters very little in the grand scheme of things. I suggest you do your best to change that by tying things from your party's background into Barovia. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of your players are secretly from Barovia or anything along those lines, but what I mean is that the world of Ravenloft and Strahd himself has a tendency to get inside the heads of people and mess with them. There are countless examples in the book where the land itself seems to just be playing mean-spirited pranks upon the players, and it can be helpful to personalize some of those. For example, corpses, spirits, or even people encountered throughout the realm may appear to be friends or family of the players. Other more direct ties can be made. The man who murdered one PC's wife may have been drawn into the mists and found in Barovia, and if the PC gets his vengeance, well, dark things may be in store for them. Actual spirits from a PC's history might appear, or family heirlooms or history may actually trace back to Barovia. And let's not forget about clerics and religion in Ravenloft. The gods cannot actually interfere with a dark domain. Instead, other darker powers pretend to be the gods of the PCs, giving them the powers they would normally get from their gods. As such, don't be afraid to twist the nature of a cleric's relationship with your deity just a little. Sneak in just a little bit of doubt in where their powers really come from. Others, such as Aasimar or warlocks, may find themselves completely cut off from their guardian angels or patrons, making them feel isolated. By the time your players storm Castle Ravenloft, they will have several magical artifacts specifically designed to destroy vampires, potentially powerful allies at their side, and will have spent the better part of the last 10 levels or so plotting how to take down Strahd. As such, if you run the fight without any changes, you can expect your group to kill Strahd in about 2 rounds of combat. That might be a bit anticlimactic. You should always keep in mind that Strahd is a powerful and intelligent foe who has been spying on the player since day one, and just like them, he has spent all that time plotting and planning how to kill them. He should be fully prepared for the final fight, and will have stacked the deck as much in favor as possible. Don't be afraid to add some minions to the fight, to try to give Strahd a few meat shields to place in between himself and the players. You can add one of the entourages he usually travels with, or let him have used his Children of the Night ability before the combat started to give him some swarms. You could also add some of the more memorable minions from the castle if the players have yet to finish them off, such as Strahd's animated armor, Rahadin, Bucephalus, or Strahd's brides. Be careful about adding vampires to the fight, however, since they will quickly die in the sunlight the players have with them, and so might not make much of a difference. Next, let's talk about Strahd's spells. Strahd is a master wizard, and as such has access to a large selection of spells. One way to make him a bit more of a challenge is to have him pre-cast some of his spells before the players enter the room to face him. Mirror Image might give him much needed survivability, and he can use Animate Object to have brought the furniture of a room he is faced in to life to give him some more minions. However, do not limit yourself to the spells he has in the book. In previous editions, Strahd had access to a much wider selection of spells. He had even invented several unique spells. And he could cast spells up to 8th level. So feel free to replace any spell he has with a spell of an equal level if you think it would help against a particular group he's facing. And if you're feeling your players are especially dangerous, you could give him access to a few higher leveled spells, just like he used to have. Finger of Death, for one, comes to mind here. Lastly, consider switching up his gear. If needed, he can use any normal armor weapon you can think of, and consider equipping him with items from his treasury if the players haven't already looted it. Having a +2 shield that gives him a +2 to initiative, for instance, would go a long way towards giving him a chance to act in any fight against your players. Also, we can look to previous editions here as well to give Strahd a boost. In 2nd edition, Strahd had a crystal ball, an amulet of proof against detection and location, a cloak of protection, and a ring of fire resistance. Any or all of which you can give to your Strahd to give him a better chance. He also used to have a +1 magical sword that he would occasionally pull out, but to be frank, his fists are probably more dangerous. But the most important thing is to try to think tactically, and to plan according to what your party is capable of. If Strahd has been doing his job, he will have been spying closely upon the party, and he will know all of their strengths and weaknesses. Don't be afraid to go after the weakest member of the party, and to avoid using spells you know they're resistant to. Normally, I would say the DM should be impartial and to do his best to make sure the players have a good time. But play this fight to win. Try to outthink your players, and when they finally take down Strahd, the victory should be that much sweeter, since they actually had to work for it. The one thing you should avoid changing is where Strahd can be found. Always make sure that the Tarokka is accurate, and that he is where it told the players he could be found. To me, it is important to have a good soundtrack when playing. Not only to put the players in the right mood, but it's important for me as a DM to put myself in the right frame of mind. As such, I put a lot of time and effort into finding the right music for my adventures, and if you're like me, you will be searching for just the right music to make Barovia come to life. So as my last piece of advice, I will share the music that I used in my sessions. Normally, I use a lot of orchestral and epic music for my D&D sessions, but that kind of music just doesn't seem right when it comes to the slow creeping dread of Ravenloft. Back when 5th edition was just released, my first game was set in Ravenloft, and I had managed to find just the right music that would serve as the basis for my Curse of Strahd soundtrack. I started out with the soundtrack to Arcanum of Steamwork and Magica Obscura. There's just something about that main theme that immediately made me think Ravenloft the first time I ever heard it. After that, it was clear that string instruments were the way to go. Another great find when it came to background music for the adventure is Philip Glass's soundtrack to Dracula. It is hard to find something more fitting than that, and it works very well together with the Arcanum music. That led me to searching out some more Philip Glass and Krone's quartet music, such as the soundtrack from The Hours for more slow-moving and emotional scenes, and the soundtrack to The Illusionist. To find something more action-packed to complement the Dracula soundtrack, I turned to music from Assassin's Creed Syndicate, which also fits in very well. That left me with a few holes in my soundtrack, where I needed to find more specific tracks for very specific places or people. For the Blue Water Inn, I used music from Sangfroid's Tales of the Werewolves. For Blinsky's Shop, I used a track from the movie Coraline and a track from Midnight Syndicate's Carnival Arcane. For Madame Eva's scene, I used another Midnight Syndicate track, Soliquay, that just left the organ scene with Strahd, where I once more turned to Midnight Syndicate to find something appropriate. Whatever music you end up using, try to remember these two things. Your players have been transported from their home to a different world, and as such, try to avoid using the same music that you normally use for D&D, and try to find music that evokes the feeling of gothic horror, for that is the essence of Ravenloft. Well, that was all the advice I had this time. If you're interested in more Ravenloft, then check out my other videos in Ravenloft month. I'll link to a playlist below, and there may yet be more to come. As always, if you enjoyed this video, then feel free to leave a like. If you want to support the channel, then please share this video on social media or with friends. It really helps out a lot. You can also follow me on Twitter or Tumblr, or check out my DM's guild page. Links to all of that in the description below. Until next time, Dungeon Delvers.